If you speak to some people in government, they will tell you that the biggest threat the City of London faces is not another banking crisis, a property bubble, or even the risk of the UK pulling out of the EU. It is the threat of a cyber attack. Cybersecurity is creeping up the agenda for the banks, asset managers and service companies that populate the square mile, but it is still regarded by most senior management as a technical and impenetrable issue they should mostly leave to their IT experts. With me are two cybersecurity experts, Adrian Culley, formerly a member of Scotland Yard's cybercrime unit and now global technical consultant at Damballa, and Christopher Forsyth, a partner specialising in cybersecurity at law firm Freshfields, Bruckhaus, Deringer. Adrian, if I could start with you, maybe you could tell us a bit about what kind of form cyber attacks take and just what kind of threats do companies in the square mile face?
So one of the most prevalent forms is what's referred to as phishing or spear phishing, which is targeted and directed emails containing malicious payloads, often a URL link to a site that's been poisoned. What's important to remember about these phishing attacks is they will appear very genuine, and they've actually been crafted to psychologically really compel you to respond.
And what are these attackers trying to achieve? I mean, what are the objects of their attacks?
High value intellectual property, data per se, accounts and passwords. There's some specific attacks against the UK financial industry at the moment. One's called CAFOR, is a particular problem for most of our banks. And the people behind these attacks are going to great lengths to get their hands on user accounts, information, intellectual property, data and intelligence.
And what about the scale of these attacks?
Sir Ian Lobban at GCHQ has said this is industrial espionage on an industrial scale. The head of cyber at MI5 has said there are now 3 certainties in life: death, taxation and a foreign intelligence service on your network. And this is an ever-present problem day to day, week to week.
Chris, what exactly, or rather, why should the city be worried about these attacks? I mean, are these attacks coming or being aimed at specific kinds of corporate activity or corporate transactions like M&A?
The city should be worried in particular for a number of reasons. First of all, the target of these attackers is data and money, and if they're hacktivists, an agenda against the capitalist system. The city has more data and more money and is a bastion of capitalism. That makes it a target. Another reason, the sheer volume of data, the sheer volume of money that flows through the city, the number of transactions and the scale of those transactions make it a very attractive target. I think there's a big reputational exposure for the city. The confidentiality of its deals is fundamental to its success as a world financial centre.
How hypothetical is it of late? Have attacks picked up significantly in the past 6 months, a year?
Cisco have reported that there's been, I think it's a 17 to 20% increase in the number of cyber attacks in the last year. At the moment in the UK, there's no obligation to report or publicise cyber attacks per se. There can be an obligation if personal data, for example, is compromised. There can be an obligation under the Data Protection Act. But because there's no obligation to report at the moment, I think a lot of them sort of go under the radar a little bit. If EU proposals to introduce obligatory reporting of cyber incidents come in, I think that could have a much more serious effect on transactions because these incidents will be made public.
And that would, the EU legislation, that would require listed companies to report significant incidences to the market.
There's a debate at the moment as to how wide the reporting obligation would be, but that's the fundamental principle. They would report the incidents to a cyber regulator, but that cyber regulator would have the power to make public those incidents if there was a national interest in doing so. So one of the challenges that people like Adrian face is the sharing of information around cyber attacks. At the moment, people are disinclined to share it because they don't want to sort of wash their dirty linen in public. But they need to share that information so they can try and combat the attacks.
And Adrian, I mean, what's the role then that businesses should play versus government? I mean, Chris was just talking about the EU's legislation, which isn't particularly popular here in the UK with the government. How do you see the situation panning out in an ideal way if we were going to combat this threat successfully?
In a nutshell, what we're talking about here in the mergers and acquisitions framework is confidence in confidentiality. With regard to that, the cybersecurity aspects, as the government report says, must be high priority. We should have a presumption that we've actually already been breached and compromised, particularly as we get into larger M&As, into millions and billions of dollars. There are a lot of parties out there with heavily vested interests in either disrupting that M&A or seeking an intelligence advantage commercially from compromising information.
Clearly, the will to improve cybersecurity exists. At the World Economic Forum in Davos this week, cybersecurity is one of the big themes under discussion. The question now is, will that desire to act translate into better practice, or will 2014 end up as a year in which London, or perhaps one of the world's other big financial centres, suffers its first major cybersecurity incident? Read more in our special report on ft.com.